The question that froze an immortal heart.
That is the queen
The
who
iron
once
gates
ruled
of the
these
Vampire
halls.
King's mansion loomed like the jaws of a sleeping beast, tall and cold and crowned with shadows that swallowed the moonlight whole. And standing before them was a girl so small she looked like she could be blown away by a single breath of night wind. Most people never came here. Most people didn't dare. But Lyra came anyway. She was barefoot, her dress too thin for the winter air, her fingers numb as she clutched a basket of night roses against her chest. And yet her spine was straight, her chin lifted, because when fear and hunger lived in you long enough, you learned how to walk beside them instead of letting them drag you down. Behind her, the city whispered. People shut their windows. Lanterns dimmed. No one wanted to be seen near the mansion of King Alaric Nocturne, ruler of the Night Court, the immortal vampire whose name alone was enough to make grown men lower their voices and mothers pull children close. Lyra swallowed. Her mother needed medicine. That was the only reason she was here. Her mother, Elara, lay in their rented attic room with a fever that refused to break, her breath shallow, her memories full of holes like pages torn from a book, and every healer had turned them away when they saw the empty purse and the worn shoes. So Lyra sold roses. Night roses bloomed only under moonlight, rare and valuable, their scent said to calm pain and ease restless dreams, and tonight she had gathered every one she could find. She raised her hand and pressed the rune bell carved into the stone pillar. The sound echoed once, then silence. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Lyra thought maybe she should leave, maybe she had been foolish, maybe she had waited too long. Then the gate spoke. Who dares knock after dusk? The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It slid through the air like cold steel, ancient and heavy with authority, and Lyra's heart stuttered in her chest. She forced herself to speak. My name is Lyra, she said, her voice trembling only a little. I'm selling night roses, sir, for medicine. Another pause. Longer this time. She shifted her weight, her feet aching on the frozen stone, her stomach growling traitorously. How much? The voice asked at last. Hope flared so suddenly it almost hurt. 1 silver for 3, she said quickly. 5 for the whole basket, they're fresh, I picked them myself. The gates groaned. Iron teeth separated inch by inch, revealing a courtyard carved from shadow and moonlight, and at its center stood a man who did not look like a monster at all. He was tall, wrapped in a black cloak edged with silver, his crown shaped like twisted thorns, his face pale and sharp and heartbreakingly tired. His eyes were red. Not cruel. Not angry. Just ancient, as if he had seen too many endings. King Alaric Nocturne looked down at the small girl in the threadbare dress, and something flickered in his expression, something he hadn't felt in centuries. Come inside, he said. Lyra hesitated. Every story her mother had ever told her screamed danger, but something in the king's voice held no malice, only weariness. I'll buy them all, he added almost absently. Her breath caught. All of them? Yes. He reached into his cloak, then stopped. When did you last eat? Her stomach answered before she could. The sound echoed embarrassingly loud in the stone courtyard. Alaric exhaled slowly. Come, he said more gently, you'll eat first. Inside, the mansion was enormous, all marble floors and towering ceilings, chandeliers glowing with unmoving candle flames, walls lined with tapestries depicting forgotten wars and forgotten crowns. It was beautiful. And unbearably lonely. Lyra sat where he told her, eating bread and cheese like someone who hadn't known warmth in days, while the Vampire King watched her with an expression that bordered on pain. And then she saw it. At the base of the grand staircase, lit by dozens of candles, stood a massive portrait in a gilded frame. The woman in the painting was young and radiant, dressed in moon-colored silk, her eyes gentle, her smile soft and familiar in a way that made Lyra's breath leave her lungs. Her heart began to pound. Her fingers trembled as she stepped closer. She knew that face. She saw it every morning. Every night. In sickness and in sleep. That's my mom, Lyra whispered. The world stopped. The tray slipped from the king's hands and shattered against the marble floor, crystal ringing like a funeral bell. Alaric stared at the girl. Then at the portrait. Then back at the girl again. Impossible, he breathed. Lyra turned to face him, her small shoulders squared, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. Why, she asked, is my mom's photo in your mansion? The candles flickered violently. The air thickened. And for the first time in 200 years, the Vampire King of the Night forgot how to breathe. The truth the king was never meant to know. The silence that followed Lyra's question was heavier than any shout. King Alaric Nocturne stood frozen before the portrait, his immortal body unmoving, His crimson eyes locked onto the painted face he had mourned for nearly 2 centuries, and for the first time since he had been crowned, power meant nothing. Because power could not explain this. Because power could not undo this. That's not possible, he said at last, though his voice lacked conviction. That woman, she vanished. Lyra shook her head slowly, her fingers clenched in the hem of her dress. My mom didn't vanish, she said. She's sick. She forgets things. She wakes up crying sometimes, holding a moon-shaped locket she doesn't remember owning. The room seemed to tilt. Alaric closed his eyes. The locket. The memory struck him like a blade. He had given it to Alara the night he asked her to stay with him forever, the night he believed love might finally conquer the curse of immortality. How old are you? He asked quietly. 6, Lyra replied. My mom says everything before that feels like a dream she can't wake from. The words settled between them like a verdict. 6 years. Not 200. Not centuries ago. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Alaric turned away sharply, pacing the marble floor as if movement could silence the storm tearing through his thoughts. I searched for her, he said almost to himself, for decades. The council told me she fled. That humans always do. Lyra frowned. My mom isn't a coward, she said firmly. She helps people who can't pay. She gives medicine for free. She wouldn't leave someone she loved. Her certainty struck deeper than accusation. Alaric stopped pacing. Slowly, impossibly, the Vampire King knelt before her, lowering himself to her eye level, ignoring every rule of dominance, every law of fear that had built his reign. You believe her, he said. I know her, Lyra answered. Something ancient cracked inside him. Before he could speak again, a violent knock echoed through the hall. Not at the gate. Inside the mansion. Alaric's head snapped up. The air turned cold. A black raven burst through the high window, glass shattering as it landed on the banister, a scroll tied to its leg with blood-red wax. The seal of the Vampire Council. Alaric tore it free. His jaw tightened as he read. They know, he muttered. Lyra felt fear crawl up her spine. Who knows? The Council, he said, his voice darkening. They always watch. Always listen. And if they know you're here. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The candles lining the hall flared violently, shadows twisting like living things along the walls. Alaric moved fast. Stay close to me, he commanded, placing a protective hand on Lyra's shoulder as he guided her deeper into the mansion, through hidden corridors and locked doors that whispered open at his touch. They descended into the Hall of Records, a forbidden wing few had ever entered. Ancient books lined the walls, their spines cracked with age, pages yellowed with secrets long buried. Alaric pulled volume after volume from the shelves, his movements urgent. There, he said, stopping abruptly. He laid the book open. Lyra leaned closer. The pages described forbidden spells, memory seals, punishments reserved not for enemies, but for traitors to vampire law. One passage was marked with a familiar sigil. Elder Malrek. The same elder who had once accused Alaric of weakness. Memory severance, Alaric whispered, his voice shaking. A spell to erase love, alter time, and exile a human without killing them. Lyra's chest tightened. You mean they did this to my mom? Alaric's hands curled into fists. Yes. The truth settled like thunder. They stole her memories, he said, fury rising, and hid her among mortals, believing time would erase what they couldn't. Lyra felt tears burn her eyes, but she stood tall. Then fix it, she said simply. Alaric looked at her. Really looked. You don't fear me, he said. You bought my roses, Lyra replied, and you fed me. The simplicity of her trust cut deeper than any blade. Before he could answer, the ground shook. A horn sounded from beyond the mansion walls. The council had arrived. Alaric straightened, every trace of gentleness replaced by cold, lethal authority. They will try to take you, he said, and if they succeed, your mother will never be free. Lyra swallowed. Then don't let them, she said. For the first time in centuries, the Vampire King smiled. Not cruel. Not proud. But resolute. No, he said, rising to his full height, shadows bending to his will, I won't. The council's judgment and the child who refused to bow. The great throne hall of Nocturne Palace had not been filled in decades. Its towering pillars carved with ancient victories, its black marble floor polished smooth by centuries of fear and obedience, now echoed with footsteps once more as the Vampire Council arrived in full authority. Elders draped in ceremonial robes entered first, their expressions carved from cold superiority, their eyes scanning the room not for threats but for weakness. Behind them followed guards in crimson armor, spears tipped with silver runes, weapons meant not for enemies but for reminders. King Alaric stood alone at the center of the hall. Lyra stood beside him. Whispers rippled through the council. A human child. Uninvited. Unimportant. Or so they thought. Elder Malrek stepped forward, his thin lips curling into a smile that held no warmth. So, he said, his voice echoing through the chamber, the rumors were true. You have brought a mortal into sacred halls. Lyra felt the weight of 100 eyes pressed down on her like stones. She lowered her head slightly. Not in submission, but to steady herself. Alaric did not move. You sent for this council, he said evenly, because you feared what you could no longer hide. Malrek laughed softly. Hide? He replied. We protected you, King Alaric. You loved a human. You grew weak. We corrected the error. Lyra's breath hitched. That's my mom, she said suddenly, her small voice slicing through the hall like a blade. The elders turned. Some scoffed. Some sneered. Malrek raised an eyebrow. Child, he said dismissively, you should be grateful. Your mother lived instead of dying for forbidden love. Lyra clenched her fists. You stole her memories, she said. You erased her life. You let her suffer while you sat on thrones. A murmur spread. Elder Malrek's smile vanished. Silence, he snapped. You are nothing. That was when Alaric stepped forward. The room seemed to shrink around him. She is everything, he said, his voice calm but carrying power that made even the guards stiffen. And you will not speak to her that way again. Malrek's eyes flashed. You kneel to a child now? He sneered. This is why the council questioned your right to rule. Alaric raised his chin. You questioned it because I chose mercy over cruelty, he replied, and tonight the court will hear the truth. With a single motion he gestured toward the far wall. The portrait of Alara emerged from shadow, illuminated by rising torchlight. Gasps filled the hall. She was taken, Alaric said, her memories sealed. Her life rewritten. Not for treason but for love. Malrek scoffed. You cannot prove. The doors slammed shut. A massive crystal sphere descended from the ceiling, glowing with ancient magic. The orb of truth. The council froze. Alaric's eyes burned red. I invoke bloodright, he declared. Let truth speak. The orb flared. Images spilled into the air. Alara screaming as spells wrapped around her mind. Elders standing silent. Malrek giving the order. The hall erupted. Some elders stepped back in horror. Others stared at the floor in shame. Lyra watched, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. You did this, she whispered. Malrek's composure cracked. She made him weak, he snarled. She threatened our rule. Alaric's voice dropped. No, he said, you feared what you could not control. Guards shifted uneasily. For the first time the council was exposed. Lyra stepped forward. You think power means taking, she said, her voice shaking but strong, but my mom taught me power means helping. You don't deserve thrones. Silence followed. Heavy. Unavoidable. Alaric turned to the guards. Arrest Elder Malrek, he commanded. The guards hesitated. Then moved. Malrek shouted. You cannot do this. Alaric looked down at him. I already have. The mother who remembered and the fall of the proud. Elder Malrek was dragged from the throne hall in chains of glowing silver, his shouts echoing uselessly against the stone walls that had once amplified his power. The remaining elders stood frozen. For the first time in centuries the Vampire Council looked afraid. Not of rebellion, but of consequence. Lyra watched as Malrek disappeared beyond the great doors, her hands trembling, her heart pounding, because justice was finally moving, but justice always came with fear. Alaric knelt beside her again, his cloak pooling on the marble floor like spilled shadow. It's not over, he said softly. What they did to your mother can be undone, but it will hurt. Lyra swallowed. Hurting is better than forgetting, she said. Those words stayed with him. Unforgiving. They moved through the castle in silence, descending into the sanctum of bloodlight, a chamber older than the throne itself, its walls carved with runes of healing and sacrifice. At the center stood a crystal basin filled with silver-red liquid that glowed faintly, pulsing like a living heart. The spell requires truth, Alaric explained, and consent. Lyra nodded. She'd choose to remember. Alara was brought in by healers, weak but awake, her hair unbound, her eyes distant and confused. She looked around the chamber, then at Lyra. My little star, she murmured. Lyra ran to her, clinging tightly. It's okay, Mama, she whispered. I found the truth. Elara looked at Alaric. Something flickered. Recognition struggling against chains of magic. You, she said uncertainly, you feel familiar. Alaric's voice trembled. Because you loved me, he said, and they tried to erase it. Tears welled in Elara's eyes. I don't remember, she said, ashamed, but my heart feels heavy like something was stolen. That was enough. The ritual began. Alaric sliced his palm, letting immortal blood drip into the basin. Light flared. Runes ignited. Elara screamed as memories surged back, centuries compressed into moments, love and loss colliding violently. Lyra held her mother, refusing to let go. Then silence. Elara collapsed. For one terrifying second, no one breathed. Then she opened her eyes. Clear. Focused. Full. Alaric, she whispered. The name broke him. He caught her as she fell into his arms, sobbing openly, a king unmade by love restored. Across the palace, consequences rippled outward. Elders who had supported Malrek were stripped of rank. Guards who had obeyed unlawful orders were dismissed. The people gathered outside the gates, whispers turning into cheers as word spread. A human woman. A stolen life. A child who changed everything. Alaric stood before the court once more. The era of rule by fear ends tonight, he declared. No more secrets. No more erased lives. The council bowed. Not out of tradition. Out of shame. Lyra stood between her mother and the king, small but unbreakable. You listened, she said. Alaric smiled gently. You taught me how. The crown that bowed to kindness. By dawn, the gates of Nocturne Palace stood open. That alone was unheard of. For centuries, the people of the city had only known the vampire king as a shadow behind stone, a ruler whose power was absolute and distant, whose mercy was rumored but never witnessed. Today they gathered in the courtyard. Humans, vampires, healers, merchants, those who had been ignored, dismissed, or made invisible. They came because word had spread faster than fear. A human woman had been stolen from her life. A child had walked into a king's mansion and spoken the truth. And the night had answered. Alaric stood before them without his crown. The elders who remained knelt behind him, stripped of their titles, their authority dissolved by exposure and consequence. Elder Malrek was brought forward last, bound in chains, his face pale not from immortality but from disgrace. You ruled through erasure, Alaric said, his voice carrying across the crowd. You punished love and called it law. Malrek spat. You weakened our kind, he snarled, for a mortal. Lyra stepped forward. She did not shout. She did not tremble. You weakened yourselves, she said, by forgetting what kindness is. The crowd went silent. Alaric raised his hand. By ancient law, he declared, any ruler who abuses power shall be stripped of immortality's privilege. A gasp rippled through the courtyard. Malrek's eyes widened in terror. No, he whispered. The spell was swift. The glow faded from Malrek's veins. Time returned to him all at once. He collapsed, mortal, ordinary, forgotten. Instant karma. Justice without cruelty. The crowd erupted. Not in violence. In relief. Elara stood beside Alaric, her hand resting over Lyra's shoulder. She looked at the people, at the palace, at the life that had been stolen and returned. We don't need revenge, she said gently. We need remembrance. Alaric turned to the people. From this night forward, he said, no human will be erased. No love will be punished. No power will exist without accountability. Then, slowly, deliberately, the vampire king knelt. Not to the council. Not to tradition. To a child. To a mother. To the truth. Gasps turned to tears. Lyra hugged him without fear. Thank you, she whispered. He smiled. No, he replied. Thank you for reminding me who I was meant to be. The sun rose higher. For the first time, light touched the palace walls. And it did not burn.